Politicians being economical with the truth is nothing new, though it is perhaps most galling when it takes place during a general election. But sometimes the greatest sin is that of omission. What our elected representatives choose not to talk about, well, it's just as important as what they do. Certainly, that's the view of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who've declared a plague on all their houses, criticising the major parties for what they're calling a conspiracy of silence when it comes to their fiscal plans, what they want to spend on, and how they find the money. And it won't have escaped your attention, that's not the only thing to go under the radar of this election. Anyone heard Brexit being mentioned recently? I'm Niall Paterson, and in this edition of the Sky News Daily, we'll be asking why for politicians, silence is gold. Never himself economical with the truth, or indeed with his bar charts, our economics editor, Ed Conway, is back on the Sky News Daily. Ed, let's start with the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IFS. They're calling it a conspiracy of silence. What are they talking about?
They're talking about the fact that basically all of the parties have signed up to a spending plan, a set of spending plans in the future that has some massive holes in it. Essentially, it commits the UK to what look like, relatively decent increases in spending in the future. But actually, when you kind of then separate, okay, what are the bits that we know we're going to spend quite a lot on, things like health, like defence, education to some extent. If you separate that stuff out, then the rest basically has no money left. And you're talking about, for those other kind of unprotected departments, you're talking about more austerity. And none of the parties have adjusted for this in their manifestos. So there's this enormous kind of big gaping hole. And it just kind of suits them all not to want to talk about it. But my point is that it goes well beyond that. There's way more. The conspiracy of silence is deeper than you could possibly believe.
But let's start, though, with this black hole, because it is a significant point to make, because there will be, we're all anticipating, if things don't dramatically improve in terms of the economy, or if something magical does not happen, we are looking at departmental budgets being cut to pay for the promises in these politicians' manifestos. Am I right?
Yeah, to make the sums that they have all committed to add up, the baseline at the bottom of those sums, you would need either enormous cuts that I think a lot of people think are basically unrealistic, or you need to put more money in. And given none of those, the major parties at least, have committed to putting more money in because it makes their sums suddenly not kind of work out. And given that this is kind of inconvenient, and given there is a very straightforward way of not confronting this issue, which is not to talk about it, the conspiracy of silence, that's kind of where we are.
But Ed, like you, I have been through the Conservative, the Lib Dem, the Labour manifestos, and at the back, they've all got these tables, and the money in and the money out, it seems to add up. So where's the problem?
It does. But that's because they are just not looking at the other stuff. I said I wasn't going to go into the weeds, but here I am. What you do is you basically say, we're going to be increasing overall departmental spending in the next kind of 4 or 5 years or whatever it is, by about 1% a year in real terms.
On top of inflation?
On top of inflation. What you don't have to do is specify exactly where that money is spent. But anyone else who's out there who understands both the history and also some of the commitments that have been made understands that a disproportionate amount of that is going to go on the NHS.
Yeah, that goes up by more than 1% a year.
It does. And so do other bits. If you're committing to getting kind of defence spending up, if you're committing to various different kind of educational commitments you've got. So you just don't have enough left for the rest of it. And take all of that together and you're just talking about, a continuation, a resumption of austerity if you're taking them absolutely at their words. But like I say, they don't want to put this into explicit language. It's frustrating and it's dishonest, and everyone kind of knows it's a bit of a, not quite telling the truth.
But is it deceitful, Ed? Because ultimately, whoever wins will have to produce a spending review at some point.
If by deceitful you mean that the people who are determining policy within these parties gets it, everyone outside who's looking at the numbers, like people like the IFS, people, journalists like us, we get it. If that's deceitful, if they get it and they continue to pretend that it doesn't matter, then I guess it is deceit. But I would just say it's kind of par for the course in elections, and all of the parties kind of being vaguely complicit about not talking about X or Y just because it's just too inconvenient to do it and it doesn't suit their narrative, and they just much rather focus on the particular attack message or particular defence message, hope, change, whatever it is. So I'm jaded enough to know that frankly, no one cares that much about me or the IFS being a bit annoyed about it.
Well, I do.
Well, thanks.
I do.
Yeah.
But if there is a black hole, a financial black hole in anyone's plans, there's one thing that's going to have to come then, isn't there? Tax rises, and tax rises we're already getting, which they're not talking about.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that I think there's a bit of a conspiracy of silence on. The Tories, Labour, Lib Dems, they are all saying they're not going to raise any of the major rates of income tax, national insurance, VAT. What that kind of fails to mention is they're still going up. Your income tax is still going up because you have your kind of tax-free allowance has been frozen. So more and more people, millions of people, are being dragged into paying more tax. You're just not paying it in terms of a higher rate on all of your money. You're just paying it on proportionately more of your money. This is why we've been kind of going on about the tax burden. Because if you look at any of the parties' manifestos, they're all consistent with the tax burden going higher and higher and higher. And maybe that's fine, okay? A lot of people, when they're asked in surveys, they often say, I would be happy to pay more tax if it was for better public services. But it's worth just saying, all of these parties are going to raise taxes on you, according to their plans. That they just don't particularly want to talk about that. They'd much rather say, oh, the rate of tax, that won't go up, don't worry about that. But frankly, that's not the only bit that matters. It's the other bit as well. It's how much of your income you're paying in tax. And that bit is going up, and all of them have signed up to that as well. They don't want to talk about it, but they've signed up to it.
But that is the thing, isn't it? There is not a single major party, at the very least, at this election who is saying that they will unfreeze the thresholds and making that part of their campaign. And indeed, all of the three that we're talking about here, Lib Dems, Labour and the Conservatives, that you dig into the figures again, and it's not about tax rises this time, but they do seem to be making an awful lot out of clamping down on tax avoidance in order to balance the books.
Yes, it's very, very convenient. It's the kind of magic money tree of tax avoidance. If you look at the main parties' manifestos, where is most of their money going to come from that they're raising to do some of the giveaways they want to do? It is, lo and behold, that they can raise money by clamping down on tax avoiders. Except in the case of the Conservatives, they think they can raise even more money from clamping down on benefits recipients. But either way, this is not guaranteed money. Can't be sure that you can raise 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion, or whatever they want to say they can raise out of this. B, it's not painless. You're not talking about people who are kind of breaking law. You're talking about people who are kind of have structured their affairs in a way that means that they kind of pay less tax. Often, the people who we're talking about here, it's self-employed people. It's kind of middle-income people. It's not your super rich. And yet, when you see it in the manifesto, there's none of that talk whatsoever. It's just like, here is a convenient 5 billion, 6 billion pounds, which we can put in, which enables us then to spend that money elsewhere.
It's fantasy politics, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but again, they've been doing this for decades. Every single budget, pre-budget report, whatever it was, they would have an extra bit of money that they were supposedly going to make out of tax avoidance clampdowns. And actually, they did make a certain amount out of it. But it's odd that it's the biggest amount of all of the kind of money-raising things isn't, oh, we're going to raise this tax. The biggest money raiser is this magic money tax avoidance tree. But all of the parties, like I say, it's another one of these conspiracy of silence, or whatever you want to call it in this case, where all of the parties have tacitly signed up to it. So they can't slag each other off about it much, because they're all doing it. They're all at it.
I mean, look, you and I, over the time that I've been doing this podcast, have talked about it an awful lot. I'm not sure that I have heard the word out of any of the three party leaders that we've been referring to, Brexit. I mean, where has that gone this election? Not that I'm sad to see the back of it.
No, didn't I once on a podcast with you say Brexit's boring?
Yes,
and
you did.
It got me very unpopular as a result, because for some people, apparently, it's very exciting. My point there wasn't to say Brexit is unimportant. It's definitely important. Yeah. It's just that the stuff that it deals with is inherently the boring end of policy. It's kind of regulations and free trade agreements, which I love, but I don't think everyone loves it as much as I do. Brexit is just, when you think about the last election, that was the Brexit election. It was to get Brexit done as far as the Conservatives was concerned. It was stop Brexit for the Liberal Democrats. It just hasn't really come up this time. And I don't know, I wonder if the parties are kind of slightly tapping into the fact that actually maybe people kind of don't want to talk about Brexit quite as much this time as they did last time around. They want to believe it's done.
When we say we're not talking about Brexit, what are we meaning? Are we not talking about people's views of Brexit? Are we talking about Brexit outcomes? Are we talking about what happens next with Brexit and indeed our relationship with the European Union? I mean, or is it just everything?
It's kind of everything. It's more just that it's like an emphasis thing. Labour Party just don't want to talk about it much. The Conservatives want to say, listen, it's been far better than you think it has been. Look, we're fourth biggest trading nation in the world. And don't get me started on that one. There's a whole video you can watch on that online of me going into that claim and just how nonsensical it is, which it is. But the Liberal Democrats, it was literally the front cover of their manifesto, the Joe Swinson manifesto back in 2019, Stop Brexit. This time you have to go all the way to the back to find any mention of it. And it's en passant, Brexit, yes, obviously in the long run we'd like to be back in the EU, but we don't see that happening anytime soon. So it's just weird how it is the topic that hasn't really barked. But like I say, maybe everyone is happy for that because we're just so exhausted about having to talk about Brexit and we'd rather not talk about it. What I do think that it will be significant, and I think we should be talking about it because part of our destiny is how we shape our relationship with the rest of the world. And so if Brexit could be defused as a kind of ideological, as one of those kind of values-driven issues, and we could talk about it pragmatically, then great. But I mean, we're not quite in those promised lands yet.
Surely it's also true that we are ignoring those broader, large-scale, big-picture geopolitical concerns that frankly, dwarf a lot of the minutiae that we end up discussing in a general election.
Let me give you an example of that, which I think is such a big deal, and it's a decision that needs to be made more or less immediately. China has become one of the world's biggest exporters of electric cars. A large and growing proportion of cars that we get these days, particularly electric cars, come from China, okay? And now think about the fact that America and Europe have just imposed big tariffs on Chinese cars, Chinese electric vehicles. And so there is a massive question facing whoever's going to be Prime Minister, on July the 5th, which is, what are you going to do? Are you going to impose extra tariffs on China like everyone else is? If you don't, you run the risk of essentially allowing our domestic electric vehicle industry to be crumpled because there's just no way they can compete with the Chinese. But on the flip side, if you do impose these tariffs, then you're talking about raising car prices. Just on the tail end of a cost of living crisis, you're talking about raising car prices by, 20, 30, 40% potentially for people, depending on how high you want to make the tariff. That's massive. So this is a really, really chewy issue that I haven't heard at all. I haven't heard this discussed at all on the campaign trail. I have no idea what Labour would do about it. I'm not quite sure what the Conservatives would do about it either. But we need to know.
Yeah, it really doesn't feel like we've had that conversation at all. Ed, you take a breather just for a second. The list of things our politicians don't want to talk about is as long as my arm. But one thing that all the politicians will be keeping close eyes on, the exit poll out at 10 o'clock on Thursday night. Ed Conway will be in the room. We'll be asking about that next. Welcome back to The Daily. Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, is still here. And Ed, let's cast our eyes forward to Thursday, and very specifically 10 p.m. on Thursday night. The point that the exit poll comes out, you're involved.
Essentially, it's 10 o'clock when the polls close. We give you the big numbers about who, according to this exit poll, is likely to be in control of the next government, if indeed anyone has a majority. The reason it's kind of a big deal is it's been really accurate. Post 1992, it's been close enough to give you a really good sense at 10 o'clock of what the likely result is. Okay, and this time, I guess the litmus test is, are all those polls that we've been hearing about with this enormous potential Labour majority, are they on the money? Are they kind of off? And for the first time, I'm going to be inside the kind of inner sanctum. I want to be very clear, I'm not in any way an author of the exit poll. There's a kind of lock-in where the exit poll is actually being devised over the course of the day as the data is kind of coming in. And so by the time 10 o'clock comes, I'll be kind of given my phone back. I'll race back towards the main studio, and I will give you, I guess, more of a detailed take about what we've learned from the exit poll in that first hour than we've ever had before. So you can get it before you go to bed on Thursday night, ideally. And secondly, then over the course of the evening and into the morning, I know you always tune in because you love this stuff, then we will be able to look at some of the results coming out and go, does that kind of tie in with the exit poll? And that's actually really useful because then you can start to say, we know what the narrative is. It's forming, in front of our eyes. Or is this narrative totally different to the one we learnt about at 10 o'clock? We've got more kind of toys and tools to be on that issue kind of earlier than in the past. But, watch this. I don't want to give too much away. You've got to watch this space.
I mean, it's like Christmas has come early for you, Ed, I presume. But, as you say, it has been incredibly accurate in years past. I would suggest that, there have been some boundary changes and indeed a gap in the polls that might make things a little bit different this time around. How does it actually work? How do we get to those figures that were so close last time around?
So we, the broadcasters, Sky, ITV, BBC, it's our exit poll. Again, we commission Ipsos UK, who are the polling company, to be outside a certain number of polling stations. It's actually kind of surprisingly small number. It's only 133 polling stations.
What? Not even 133 constituencies, just 133 polling stations?
No. This is the way it's been done for a long time. But by looking at the change, not just over a constituency, but in that specific polling station compared with last time and the time before, and by looking at those changes and then also looking across at different parts of the country, and trying to work out, is that change uniform? Or is it slightly more in this area that has this particular trend? Is it more in areas that voted heavily for Brexit? What are we seeing, for instance, in Scotland with the SNP and with Labour? So the numbers come in, and then you have all the boffins who, as I say, they're in a totally separate room to me. So they do their thing, and then they come out with the numbers that we then later on get. But you're completely right, Neil. I think this particular one is tough. It's tough for a couple of reasons. First of all, the boundary changes you mentioned. They've worked really hard at trying to find the right polling stations that mean that they can actually look back through history and also append that kind of trends to different constituencies. And I think the second thing is it always gets a bit tougher when you have a kind of the two main parties aren't the big ones, or at least are not the only story. That, within our kind of first past the post, winner-takes-all system, just creates this extra level of chaos that makes it quite difficult to be sure about the number.
There is a bit, amigos, who cares? We know who's won it. And I suppose that flows from the fact that perhaps this general election, we have all become just a little bit too beholden to the polls. Although I suppose, come 10 o'clock on Thursday, we will know whether our politicians giving us the silent treatment has actually worked out in their favour as they'd hoped.
I put so much work into making this exit poll experience good, and you just don't care. No, I think you've got a point in that if the surveys we've seen thus far are right, then it's a thumping majority. It's this enormous landslide. But frankly, they're not always right. There's a lot of kind of question marks over it. And the exit poll, obviously, that's not the eventual result, but it is the most reliable electoral poll that we have. And that comes quite a few hours before we start getting the numbers that really tell us what the story is. So if they're doing their job well, then the result hours before everyone else. And I will know the result hours before you, because I'm in the lock-in. But I don't have my phone, so I'm not going to tell anyone about it. But it will make me happy.
Ed, time for you now to give us the silent treatment. Go off and rest those vocal cords before 10 o'clock on Thursday night. Ed Conway.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, mate. There's a very old joke about our MPs, so forgive me if you've heard it before, and it goes like this. How do you know a politician is lying? Because their mouth is moving. But in keeping stum, in refusing to talk honestly about fiscal policy, well, they're not exactly telling you the whole truth either. That's your lot for today. We'll be back again tomorrow.